So, on June 28th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, but that doesn't necessarily mean that World War I was going to kick off. Instead, Europe entered into what was known as the July Crisis, in which parties sympathetic to Conrad's view would push the nations of Europe towards war. Now, growing up, a lot of you probably were taught that the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the final kind of nail in the coffin, that Europe was bound to have an industrial war in the early 20th century, and that this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, it is going to be that case, however, it didn't necessarily have to be. You have to understand a few things about Franz Ferdinand, and I kind of touched on them in the previous episode. See, Ferdinand, although he was the heir to the throne, he was never hugely popular with, the royal family, the civil government. He was somewhat popular with the military, but he wasn't a very popular figure with the general public either, especially, if you weren't Austrian, because he was very much a pro-Austrian. He was also a very big anti-Semite. He was kind of like a proto kind of like a fascist type guy in that regard. He was a very staunch Austrian nationalist. And when you're running a large multi-ethnic empire with, dozens and dozens of nationalities and ethnicities, it's kind of hard for you to have that stance and remain popular with the general public. He was also not popular with the royal family, as I've noted. Franz Joseph, the emperor, wasn't a big fan of him, and they often kind of butt heads on a lot of things, namely with Conrad's appointment in the first place. If you remember, Franz Ferdinand's the guy who got him the job, and Franz Joseph wasn't exactly thrilled about it originally, but had been talked into it. And also, even Conrad and Franz Ferdinand, who had been friends at this point, their friendship is completely broken. But Conrad sees this as an opportunity, he and his kind of, his pro-war party. So during this period of the July Crisis, which is going to last from June 28th through the month of July up until the war officially begins on July 28th when they declare war on Serbia, Conrad is going to be constantly pushing along with his war party to have the emperor officially declare war on Serbia, knowing kind of full well that this is going to cause a European-wide conflict. But Conrad kind of wants that in a certain sense because he can use it to knock out not only Serbia, but other potential enemies. And he knows that his ally Germany will be brought into the war. So that's what he's going to be pushing during that kind of whole month. Now, while Conrad and the war party were ecstatic that the country was being plunged into war, the Emperor Franz Joseph never wanted it to happen. He was always a very kind of, well, not always, but in his old age up until this point, he had always been an advocate for peace. He had a lot of run-ins with Conrad in the past couple years due to his kind of warmongering and Franz Joseph wanting to maintain peace. And so when he does finally sign the declaration of war on the 28th, it's reported that he signed it reluctantly and tearfully because he wanted to dedicate the final years of his life to peace, and he had just been kind of, his hand was forced. Conrad had been able to stir up enough kind of, support not only with the war cabinet, but also with the general public to drive the country towards war. So mobilization against Serbia is going to officially begin on July 25th. The declaration of war is going to be passed on the 28th, and then general mobilization will start on the 31st of July. Now, with the war initiated, Conrad took full control of all the armed forces of the empire in the form of what is known as the Armee Oberkommando, which I'm not going to try to pronounce in a German accent. From here on out, I'm just going to refer to it as the AOK. And technically, this AOK is led by Archduke Friedrich of the royal family, because it is supposed to be, like, especially during times of war, it's supposed to be the emperor and his family that controls these power centers. But in reality, Friedrich was a puppet of Conrad to a certain degree, and Conrad has total control over the AOK. And on top of that, the AOK operated independently from both the civil government and the monarchy, and essentially becomes a wartime military dictatorship. The Germans are also going to have something kind of similar as well. So essentially, Conrad and he's at the head of this, so he's essentially become a military dictator of Austria-Hungary. Not in the sense of like Hitler or Mussolini or anything like that, but he has kind of total reign over the military, and since they're at war, he kind of has total reign of the country. He gets to decide what happens. And so we now have a guy who had never really been a leader. He had, like I said in the previous episode, he had like different leadership positions that he had later in his career, but most of the time it's spent as a staff officer, and really had only ever had experience in combat, like really once in Bosnia, and then he had that insurrection in Tyrol during his brigade leadership time. But now he's leading one of the largest nations in Europe into the greatest conflict in history, and really his only experience has been as a teacher and a staff officer. And with that, you can kind of see why the war is going to go poorly for the empire. So it became immediately apparent that Conrad's grand strategic plans were not worth the paper they were written on. During the July crisis, when Conrad was supposed to be preparing his army for the invasion of Serbia, which looked unrealistic to many cabinet members, he decided to take a 2-week vacation. So the time comes for him to finally, carry out something that he'd been dreaming about doing for years, and all of a sudden he just decides to peace out. And then when he's finally confronted with the forthcoming invasion, which had to be done quickly if it were to be effective, Conrad responded to this by saying that they would not be able to execute the invasion for several weeks. So basically, this is something that he had been planning for years. He knew for a fact that if it was going to be effective, he had to do it pretty rapidly. Any troops that he had already mobilized prior to the declaration of war had to be pushed into Serbia as soon as possible. But he basically said, when he was confronted by, the royal government, or the imperial government, basically he said, yeah, we can't really do this for a few more weeks, and just kind of shrugged it off. And this ends up giving Serbia a lot of time to prepare their defenses, right after war is declared. So they've already kind of given a heads up, hey, they're going to come down here and attack us. And so they have time to mobilize. And if you remember correctly, that the Serbians had already, had a war with the Ottomans a year prior, so their army was already kind of ready for conflict. And now they're given extra time. He essentially shrugs off any implications of war with Russia, which seemed likely to follow the invasion of Serbia. The mobilization for defense from Russia with simultaneous offensive action against Serbia was time-sensitive, but it appeared that Conrad didn't really understand this. In reality, Conrad was wholly focused on Serbia and had planned to use the force meant to defend against Russia to bolster the invasion of Serbia. So it was always implied that any kind of war with Serbia would imply war with Russia. For whatever reason, I guess Conrad was either ignorant of or arrogant in that regard. Russia was always going to come to the aid of their Slavic brothers. This was apparent years prior during the annexation crisis. So again, for whatever reason, Conrad just kind of decides to ignore this fact. So when the war begins, all those forces that should be on the Eastern Front preparing for a defense against Russia, almost all of those forces are being sent to the Serbian front in the south. So this means by the time that the KUK forces were meant to join with Germany against the Russians in the east, a lot of those forces ended up being delayed, and some of them even remained in the Balkans for several months to continue that campaign. And like I said, the rest of them were kind of delayed getting to the Eastern Front, which means the initial blows from the Russians were far more devastating. In fact, in the first 3 weeks of combat on the Russian front, 1/3 of the forces of the KUK that were on that front were combat ineffective. So they were either high casualty rates, KIAs, missing in action. So that entire defense force that is sent over there is pretty well knocked out within the first few weeks of the war. And again, you have to look to the fact that it's kind of Conrad's fault in both regards. A, because he underestimated the Russians' ability to mobilize their forces, and then his inability to mobilize his own forces and kind of focus on the Serbians while ignoring any kind of a Russian threat. So, and this is going to end up resulting in a common pattern throughout the rest of the Eastern Front War, where Conrad would act without any kind of coordination with his German counterparts. His armies would get decimated, and then he would be bailed out by the Germans. The only reason that the Eastern Front doesn't collapse for the Empire early on in the war is because the Germans are able to bolster it. The Russians are able to make quite a few advances deep within to Austro-Hungarian territory, specifically in Galicia and along the Carpathians. They're able to push pretty deep into their territory, and it's only the German army who's able to come and bail them out. And if you remember, at this point in the war, the Germans are kind of focused on the Western Front anyway, and the Austro-Hungarians are supposed to be the main force in the East. So the fact that the Germans have to end up, pulling most of the weight in that front kind of just shows you how dire the situation was for the KUK and how ignorant or arrogant Conrad was to that situation. Now, as far as the war in Serbia, it wasn't going so well for Conrad and the KUK either. As with Russia, Conrad kind of underestimated his opponents, and despite outnumbering and outgunning the Serbians, I think the initial force that the Empire ends up sending down there, the KUK forces, outnumber the Serbians. I think something like 4-3, 2-1, stuff like that. And I mean, they have still, despite the fact that their rearmament efforts weren't on par with their contemporaries, they still outgun the Serbians by quite a bit. They still have better equipment, better rifles, better artillery. They're unable to crack the Serbian defenses in the early campaign due to that fact that they had to relocate a large portion of their force, the entirety of their Second Army, to the Russian front for defense. So those troops that he had relocated to Serbia to use in the offense had to be pushed back to the east to be in the defense, which is where they always were supposed to be. And the fact that the Serbians were fierce fighters and by the end of 1914 had suffered far fewer casualties than the KUK and had prevented any sort of notable advance into their territory. So basically, by the end of the first year of the war, the borders of the empire and Serbia are basically unchanged. The first campaign, the war against Serbia that Conrad had been hoping for and dreaming about for years, had basically just ended in a total defeat for the KUK, on top of the fact that he was losing on his eastern front. By now, the Germans understood what ally they were dealing with and decided that they would have to get involved if victory was to be assured. So they look at what was going on in the east, and then they look to the south, and they see, well, we're doing fairly well on the Western Front against the French and the British. We can spare more forces to assist the Austrians, because if we don't, it's going to be a bigger fault, because the Austrians are going to have to divert more forces south to deal with the Serbians, which means there's going to be less available for the east, which means we're going to have to bolster the east, so it's better for us to supply troops and armaments to help with their Serbian front. So they decide they would get involved if they were going to be able to be victorious, not only in that theater, but the war in general. The Germans now viewed Serbia as a necessary front so that railways could also be secured to the Ottoman Empire in order to reinforce them as well, because by this time the Ottomans had also joined the war on the side of the Central Powers. So they see, if we can capture Serbia, that's not only advantageous to the Austrians, but it's also advantageous to ourselves and the Ottomans, because we can have one contiguous railway system from Germany all the way to the Ottoman Empire. So, as in the East, the Germans would turn around the luck for the KUK. Not only did the Germans commit large forces to the 1915 campaign, it had also convinced Bulgaria to join the war and invade from the east. Now, Bulgaria had had a contentious relationship with the Ottomans for quite some time, but it also was a pretty big rival to Serbia. So Germany is able to convince them to join the war to attack Serbia, And the Bulgarians actually end up committing more forces than either the Germans or the Austro-Hungarians.